Hello, strangers. But it's funny, because you look kind of familiar. And it being the season of thankfulness and gratitude, I'd be remiss if I didn't say I'm very thankful for all of you. So here's another story. Story number 115. I was at a fob in the Nangarhar province of Afghanistan, back when we were in Afghanistan, that is. GWAT days, early 2010s. It was one of the only fobs I ever dutied at, but from talking to my friends who went to different bases, it was all very much the same experience. Everything was tan gray, from the tall walls to the netting stretched between tents and trailers. The trailers looked like those pod things people order up to pack away stuff for storage. The concrete barricades. Everything. Just boring, tan gray. Even our uniforms, desert camo, matching our tan boots, tan rucks. I speak from experience when I tell you that color deprivation is real. Upon return to the US, your eyes are so disused to the color green that it's vibrant. It appears neon, garish. It takes your eyes a while to get used to it again, not to pull on your BDUs and feel like you're wearing lime green. I was pulling ball watch with a buddy, Gibson. It had been quiet for the past few weeks. You might think that would put you at ease, but that feeling of calm before the storm was there, lingering like the dust in the creases of your boots, building until it finally hits some terminal surface tension and all hell breaks loose. So while the small hours of the morning are typically hard to stay awake for, Gibson and I were trying to be heads on a swivel. That feeling of a pressure building, a something's gotta give kind of vibe, battling the very natural inclination to let your head dip forward and to pass out. You have no idea how lulling it can be, passing your gaze over the same beige ruts and dips, alerting at every movement, even when it's just another random hyena or fox slinking past. We had a radio with us, and the crackle itself started to sound like one of those cheap Naturescape alarm clocks people buy to send them to sleep. Waterfalls, wind. The crackling sounded like a fire. So when a rat-a-tat of gunfire, small arms it sounded like, came over the radio, we jumped. Gibson grabbed the squawker, tried calling out to get an identity on who was transmitting, but no dice. No call back. I was scanning the terrain ahead. It was pitch black out there, and even a 22 has to have muzzle flash. Off in the distance, I thought I could just see the flashing of light, sporadic. Every time Gibson keyed off the radio, the popping rat-a-tat of gunfire would come back for a few seconds, and then drop. This happened 4 times in a row before the radio just fell silent. I ran to the HQ tent to report in. Sergeant on watch had the eye bags of a basset hound, and just as much enthusiasm as he scanned some chart on his end and told me to bag it. We had no patrols active at the time. He said it was probably just locals firing off to fire off, and told me to get my ass back to my post. My nerves were jangled, so the deadpan way he just discounted everything was welcome. I told Gibson what he'd said when I got back, and while he was annoyed and wanted more information than just ignore it, well, he knew that particular sergeant wasn't exactly known as being an open-door policy kind of guy. The question of how they could have gotten a hold of one of our radios wasn't too hard to figure. Enough skirmishes, enough supplies dropped in getaway mode. Equipment just finds its way around. I said it could have been some kids playing army, you never know. In other words, I rationalized it. There's plenty of weird stuff that happens in the area, so having something I could easily attribute to the mundane, that made me more than happy to move on. Even though it wasn't the only time it happened. Gibson and I had the same out-of-nowhere event happen another 2 nights. By night 3, we'd stopped even mentioning it to the desk sergeant. The dour old bastard with his rheumy eyes couldn't be bothered to even raise an eyebrow. I could tell it was eating Gibson, though. I asked him why. Not that I wanted to agree with Sergeant Who Cares in the tent, but if it was just the locals playing cowboys and Indians, well, why get your back up about it? But Gibson shook his head, telling me that wasn't what it was that bothered him. He went on to question the sound itself, asking me didn't it sound, well, familiar. I didn't get what he meant and said so, asking familiar in the way gunfire sounds like gunfire. He said no. To his ears, the gunfire sounded like it was repeating, the cadence, the pattern of it. I laughed, already picturing it, telling him maybe the locals had found some dropped supplies and were like setting a beat with it, firing in rhythm, the way a kid bangs on a pot with a wooden spoon. That riled Gibson up more. He snapped at me that at the least we should be concerned that kids might have guns out there, might end up hurting themselves, and why weren't we doing anything about that? But I just told him, they're just as likely to hurt you if you get involved. He blew me off, though. Didn't bring it up again. Night 5. 4 had been silent, but that weird pressure had felt double without the mystery gunfire to break it up. I don't like to admit it, but I was feeling about as rattled as Gibson by this point. The radio keyed again, and I almost breathed a sigh of relief at the return to normalcy of another salvo of rat-a-tat-ta. That relief died as a voice called in instead, breaking the silence. I about jumped. Gibson startled next to me. The voice was calm, matter-of-fact, even a little cheerful. Accented, too. It was English, and natural English at that. But the pronunciation of certain words sounded off in a regional way we couldn't place. There were no dropped R's like a Boston accent. No rolled R's like a Miami accent either. The voice was calling in, asking how we read them as Lima Charlie, meaning, did we hear them loud and clear? That voice sounded close enough to be in eyesight, so I sent back a 5 by how me, the typical verbal handshake of making contact over a radio net. They read me same, good volume and unbroken comms, then sent their message, the end of a patrol and intent to RTB, return to base. We sent back a copy and Gibson stretched over, pulling his NVGs, his night vision goggles, from his pack. I did the same, reaching right, but my hand landed on my FLIRs. FLIRs are infrared, thermal vision. Well, I figured it was just as easy to pick up returning troops by their heat signature as with night vision. I pulled the binoculars up to my eyes, just as Gibson spoke. There, I think I see someone over there. But I didn't see anything. When night falls over there, the temperature drops quick. There's no tree cover to hug old sunlight close to keep the ground warm. Through my FLIR binoculars, there was nothing illuminating the ink black before me. I pulled them away from my face and I looked out in the direction Gibson had his head facing. There were some old bedraggled trees, scrawny, looking an awful lot like the Joshua trees back home. I squinted, but the night had everything in shadow, and it was all I could do to make out the silhouette of the trees against the night sky. I told Gibson as much, and the look he shot me was pure nerves. Catching, too, as I realized that the voice on the radio may not belong to whatever Gibson thought he had seen, which, as he described it, was a man kind of hidden behind that clump of trees. Ambush. The The voice came over the radio again. The man sounded jovial. He was reporting he would be glad for a shower. Gibson radioed back, asking from what direction. There was a tension in his voice. The man responded, saying he had our base in sight. Surely we could see him by now, if we kept an eye out. Uh-oh. I had since begun rummaging through my bag, but for the life of me, my NVGs weren't in there. Had I left them in my trailer? I tapped Gibson, asking to use his. He ripped his off and handed them over as I stared directly at the clump of trees that he'd pointed to. I put them on. Nothing. I began scanning around, and just off to the left, I saw a head peek out from behind some cover, a rock maybe. It was dark and far away. Even with the magnification turned up, I could barely make it out, but our own helmets are easy to recognize. I grabbed Gibson's arm and pointed. He moved, over there. Gibson now had the FLIR binoculars. He raised them, lined them up with where I pointed. His voice was getting loud, that panic edging in as he told me, no, there's no one there. I was looking right at the head, but Gibson was telling me, no heat at all. I kept my eyes trained on the head shape I could see, bobbing this way and that, as Gibson radioed back, telling the man to stay put, but raise an arm in the air so we could see him. The radio crackled. Then, quietly, we heard him say, "Keep a good lookout then." Then, it fell silent. And as I watched, the head ducked back down again, completely hidden from view. No arm raised in the air. Gibson ran to the HQ. Sergeant might have been a turd, but every reflex, every instinct I had was that the attack, the storm after the calm, was here, and we'd stumbled onto someone setting it up. And if we didn't hurry, the returning patrol would stumble right into it too. The alarm was raised. Floodlights blazed out, scanning the area. We pointed them over and over to the trees and the outcropping of what I'd taken as a rock, but was instead just a broken piece of concrete barricade. But nothing showed up. Nothing moved. Finally, a contingent was let out from the fob to go check it out. We begged to go with, but the sergeant pointed to the duty roster. Our asses were on schedule to be watching the wall, not gallivanting around in God's wilderness. Like I said, he was a real turd. So instead we waited, staring out at the convoy as it trundled out to the clump of trees. The floodlights had been pointed away, and for good reason. If there was an imminent attack, putting a spotlight on the two trucks that bumped out over the dirt was as good as painting them with a big red bullseye. They got out there, and their heat signature. I was back on my FLIRs. It lit up like predator vision, making the hairs on my arms stand up. I'd seen through the NVGs that someone was there, was moving, but they'd not registered any body heat, not like our guys did. How? We watched them wander about. Gibson was still keying the mic, still calling out to the voice we'd heard. It had fallen silent since it failed the raise your arm test, but finally, a whoosh of static came back. But it wasn't that friendly, odd-accented voice this time. It was a member of our own convoy. My gut sank. I leveled my Nox, and sure enough, I saw one of their number with his arm crooked, holding something to his head. Loud and clear, he told us to stop transmitting. The shapes I could see on my Nox were moving quickly, jerking around like something had them spooked. Well, they weren't alone. I looked at Gibson, and his face, even with his NVGs in place, conveyed the same dread I felt. We watched them all at once hop back into their trucks and roll back. Sergeant be damned, we ran from our post and were pelting them with questions we sort of knew the answers to, but the logic wasn't logicking. They had brought back two things with them. One was the radio. Not one of our fobs, but definitely standard government issue. The other, though, explained the lack of heat signature in the worst way possible. They'd found it next to the radio, propped up by the bit of broken barricade. It was a wad of cloth wrapped around a stick and capped with a helmet. It didn't give off a heat signature because it wasn't alive. And the follow-up conclusion that makes me sweat when I think about it too much, well, it doesn't explain how it moved, who moved it, also never giving off a body temperature we could see. They had to send a convoy out the next day to collect the rest of what they'd discovered, all sorts of bomb-making charges. Afghanistan has a lot of weird stories and lore, just like any other place. We've got Mothman and the Jersey Devil. Russia has Baba Yaga, and so on. But as much as I pestered any Terps or handlers, or even the sellers in the souks, as many stories as I collected about giants in the East, I never got a good answer for any of our questions. I began telling myself it was wind. Someone had propped up that creepy thing like a scarecrow. Gibbs caught it propped up against the tree, and I caught it when it had been gusted over and rolled over to the barricade. Kids had been playing their version of a prank with the rat-a-tat-ta, just a loose collection of things that coincided with that acidy feeling of it's quiet, too quiet, that we'd been feeling. Obviously, we were on high alert for the next week or so. Gibson and I ended up on ball watch yet again, and had been told by all the previous patrols and previous watches that nothing had happened. No more mysterious rat-a-tat-ta over the radio. No flashes of light, and no more mystery helmet balls bobbing around in the periphery. It was on that ball watch that Gibson told me what he thought about the whole thing, and his answer feels a great deal more true than mine. As we sat, me with my NVGs on, of course, he explained that to his mind, the radio, the head, and the gunfire were meant to inoculate us, get us good and used to those sounds, even distract us, so that the attack, those bomb-making supplies, well, they could be built into whatever was meant to be built, and we would never see it coming. But the doers of the attack, well, they didn't count on some intervention. The voice we heard on the radio, American accent, but not quite. He believes now that the way that the voice said look out was look out Canadian. Explained why he was out there when there were no patrols on the schedule. And that guy, well, happened to be in the right place at the right time to see what our FLIR and NVGs didn't. Someone setting up an attack. An ambush, like I thought. Only the target wasn't a returning troop. It was us, all along. Well, how about that? Those who made it this far have stumbled upon another hidden story. Story 270. If you deployed to Southwest Asia, chances were you transited through Al Udeid, even if you weren't there on TDY. I did on a few occasions. I did services, which is all those people you see at the chow halls, the gyms, all the wage slave jobs whose analogs are baristas, cooks, clerks, out in the non-military world. On this one trip, I was slated for mailroom. That's one of the better jobs. Mailroom. Everybody's happy to get packages or letters from back home. Sure, sometimes you're the bearer of bad news, Dear John letters. But people tend to know when those are coming, and they don't stand around in public to open them. So like I said, mailroom isn't a bad duty to pull. One night, I woke up needing to pee really badly. We were situated in these trailers. Think long prefabricated rectangles, split into a hallway with rooms off either side. Where we were had rows and rows of them. There were no bathrooms or running water in the trailers. When nature called, you had to lump it out of your building to one of the Cadillacs or latrine buildings. Well, it was late and I was half asleep as I stumbled out of my building, heading to the nearest bathroom, which was out the end of my trailer and 4 down in the lines of other trailers. I'd just walked past the third in line. The Cadillac was up to my left, the rows of trailers to my right, when an eruption of popping sounds coming from my right jolted me. I threw myself down on the ground before I could even think. We were trained on what to do in firefights, and that sounded like someone firing off a small pistol, maybe return fire too. I laid there in the gravel, eyes wide, body already in fight or flight, while my brain caught up to recognizing what that sound was. It was out of place. Where we were on base, firefights were dead rare, never happened. My brain was skipping, trying to think of what to do. I didn't have a weapon on me. I was in my PT gear and sneakers. I was out in the open between buildings. Should I try to crawl to cover? My movement might be seen. I might be targeted. But if I stayed still, well, I was a sitting duck. The ground was gravel, and I coughed as the dust swirled up from between all the rocks, that fine as silt sand beneath them, clogging my lungs. Immediately, the pops stopped. I stayed still, looking all around, bewildered. I could see people off in the distance just walking around. Everything normal. I shoved myself up, using my hands to sweep the pebbles out from where they'd indented and stuck in my knees. I was craning around, listening for running or further pops. But nothing. It was dead silent. Feeling like a fool. Had I dreamed it? I hustled to the bathroom. It took a moment to, get things flowing. I was still keyed up from what had happened. By the time I reemerged from the Cadillac, I was still jittery. But again, I looked and just saw other airmen walking like normal. There was no indication that anything had happened at all. I decided my sleep-deprived brain had made up the whole thing. I walked back to my trailer, but I was uneasy the whole time. Nothing came of it for weeks. But one night, I was up later with some friends, watching one of those DVD box sets people send in those care packages that end up in the lending library. It was the 4th season of a show I'd never seen seasons 1 through 3 of. I really wasn't following it. So when the call of nature came, I got up and I told my friends not to pause the video. I was already outside, walking the same path back to the same Cadillac, when all at once, that popping sound again, right to my right, out of nowhere. I stutter-stepped, nearly tripping, the gravel under my feet skittering and crunching. And again, the popping stopped. Now this time I was really spooked. I wasn't sleepy, and I'd heard those pops clear as day. I stood still, looking around, scanning for movement. Where I'd stopped was between the trailers. Every few rows, there was a larger space between the trailers where someone had piled up sandbags into sort of an igloo shape over a frame. If there was an attack, we were all meant to scamper out of the plywood-strength Z-grade trailers and take shelter in the little sandbag huts. I was stood right next to one of these, as I thought, as I looked around, as I tried to piece together what it was I was hearing, when off to my right, I heard another series of pops. It was coming from the sandbags. I had turned on heel and rushed to the sandbags before I knew what I was doing. Did I have a weapon this time? Hell no. But the sound was off. Having heard it now 3 times, it wasn't gunfire I was hearing, and I had a sneaking suspicion. For what do bored airmen do but play pranks on each other? Was some little jerk scaring the crap out of people? Filming it, turning tired people here to do a job into some little meme? That was a lot more likely than I liked. I felt anger flashing even as I reached the sandbags and crouched down to look inside. It was dark in there, but not so dark that I didn't see the two people inside. One guy, one girl, pieces of their PT uniforms scattered around, or how they were positioned, or on what. From the light coming in from behind me, I could see the shiny plastic underneath them. A laugh ripped out of me at their wide, shocked eyes. A laugh of relief. This wasn't a prank turning me into a fool after all. The guy of the two was mumble-begging in this stage whisper, pleading with me not to raise the alarm, tell on them. I just shook my head and backed up, walked away from the scene. I didn't recognize either of them, didn't know what shop they worked in, and I didn't care to snitch on anyone either. I mean, what punishment could be worse than being caught the way they were? And honestly, I was just glad to have a rational explanation for hearing what I'd taken as gunfire in the middle of the base, yet no one around me hearing it. I wasn't being pranked. I wasn't going nuts. That was enough for me. Still, for the rest of the deployment in that mailroom, I couldn't help but laugh every time I saw bubble wrap. Like I said, there are a lot of weird little stories that come from places like that. And good thing too. Else, what would I have to tell you about? If you'd like to reach out, email and socials are in the description. Interacting with the like, comment, and subscribe features does something, allegedly. And otherwise, we'll meet again next Tuesday. Stay strange, stay safe, and take care, strangers.